Over the course of the 2025 NFL offseason, the Las Vegas Raiders underwent an extreme amount of change. A brand new head coach, a new offensive coordinator, a new quarterback, a new running back, and most importantly, a culture shift. This isn't your regular Raiders of the modern era. This isn't a team that I anticipate to be embarrassed week after week after week. And this is not to say they're going to be an elite squad that will take the NFL over by force. I think this team will compete week after week after week and just be a nightmare matchup for their opponents. They'll be a fighter. They'll have grit. They won't give up. I think this is a team that we were expecting to see in the 2024 season when they retained interim head coach Antonio Pierce. After that run he had at the end of the 2023 season, a lot of people thought that was the culture shift that the Las Vegas Raiders were going to have. And I know there's going to be skepticism for a franchise that is time and time again felt like they were back to being contenders and have fallen off. Today, we'll talk about the Las Vegas Raiders and what this team looks like in the 2025 regular season. This is Son of a Sports. Let's get into it. Before we go into this previous offseason and everything that's changed with the Raiders now, we have to talk about what led to these changes and what led to these changes needing to happen. So let's go back in time, the 2024 NFL offseason, and look at what happened then. The Raiders retained interim head coach Antonio Pierce after finishing the year 5-4 in 2023 after taking over when Josh McDaniels was fired. And things felt kind of hopeful for the Raiders because Pierce was a culture guy. Players loved him. Players raved about him. Davante Adams, Max Crosby, they raved about him. And the Raiders went into free agency after bringing in former GM of the Chargers, Tom Telesco, which was criticized at the time, but he did some good moves. In free agency, they brought in the number one free agent in the offseason, defensive tackle Christian Wilkins from Miami. Then they signed quarterback Gardner Minshew, who, wasn't a top guy, but had a decent year with the Colts, actually making a Pro Bowl. I know that doesn't mean that much, but he had a good enough year that they almost made the playoffs after having to take over for Anthony Richardson, who got hurt 4 games into his career. The other thing they did, which I think was met with a lot of scrutiny, was bring in former offensive coordinator of the Bears, Luke Getsy, who was fired from the Bears, and Antonio Pierce wanted him to be the play caller for the Raiders going into 2024. Okay, now let's start the 2024 season. The Raiders started 2-4, or actually 2-2 really, to go into the year through 4 weeks in the season, and at that point, Davante Adams requested a trade, was kind of tired of Antonio Pierce and everything going on with the Raiders, wanted to go to a different team, and that was already showing things were kind of shaky. Then Christian Wilkins gets hurt in October, out for the year. Then Gardner Minshew gets hurt after week 9, out for the year. And at that point, the Raiders were going through a 10-game losing streak. After that 2-2 start, the Raiders lost 10 straight games. After week 9, the Raiders said they were done with offensive coordinator Luke Getsy, who they just hired and fired him and sent him home. At the end of October, Antonio Pierce actually said to the media one of their main issues is offensive play calling and offensive structure, but decided to retain Getsy for a few more weeks before firing him because, he was not very good at his job. They had quarterback issues for the rest of that season after Minshew was down, rotating between Aiden O'Connell and Desmond Ridder. O'Connell getting hurt himself, Ridder had to start the rest of the year, and they won 2 of their last 3 games, but despite all of that 10-game losing streak had them at 4-13 to finish the year. An 8-9 team bringing in the number one free agent and a brand new quarterback finished 4-13 to end the year. It was disastrous. Something had to change. So the Raiders, everyone was speculating what was going to happen. They're going to keep Antonio Pierce, trying to keep things on track. What are they going to do? Tom Telesco had a good draft the previous year, especially considering he drafted Brock Bowers, who broke rookie records, and Jackson Powers Johnson, who at the time was viewed as the number one center of the draft class and a potential first rounder who fell to the second round, and had a decent showing his rookie year. So the Raiders did the unthinkable. They fired Antonio Pierce. And it's not really unthinkable in terms of, did he deserve to be fired? It was unthinkable because the Raiders, they like to keep guys around because the owner can't really afford to get rid of guys like that. But now the new ownership group gives them the financial flexibility to do that. So that's probably why they were able to do that. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because 2 years before then, they wanted to fire Josh McDaniels after 1 year, and ownership didn't have the money to get rid of him and keep paying him without him being the head coach. Anyways, moving on. They moved off Antonio Pierce, and 2 days later, moved off Tom Telesco. And quickly, they had to make a change. There were a lot of rumors about what the Raiders would do, what Tom Brady, the new partial owner, would be interested in. And there were rumors of Cliff Kingsbury, per se, maybe a Ben Johnson, maybe a Liam Cohen. But the Raiders went in a direction not a lot of people saw coming whatsoever. Pete Carroll, the former head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, who was kind of forced out during the 2024 offseason. And was trying to get back in NFL circles and was interested in the Bears job. That was pretty much the only rumor out there about Pete until the Raiders hired him, which was a big shocker. And it became clear immediately Pete would be the transitionary head coach for a few years. He is an older guy until they find someone permanent for the long term. And then they brought in Tampa Bay's assistant general manager, John Spytek, a guy that has a clear relationship with partial owner Tom Brady, and a guy that was extremely respected in NFL circles as a guy that was going to be a future GM, and that's what he is now. So they had their foundation, they had their front office, they had their head coach. What do they do after that? Well, they retained defensive coordinator Patrick Graham, one of the most respected defensive coordinators in all of football, and this is the third head coach he'll be a defensive coordinator under for the Raiders, which is just kind of crazy to think about. Josh McDaniels, Antonio Pierce, and now Pete Carroll. They then hired offensive coordinator Chip Kelly from Ohio State, who, yeah, in NFL circles isn't as much respected anymore, but had a really good year coaching in Ohio State and made a lot of showed a lot of change in his approach to coaching. He adjusted a lot more. He modernized his offense a lot more, and that was really interesting to see. Then they retained Max Crosby and signed him on a massive extension that made him one of the highest paid non-quarterbacks in all of football. And that was a big sign of, we want to keep our guy, our culture's here, we're building this, and we're going to keep going. So the big thing they really did, they traded for Geno Smith, the shocker of shockers, because Geno was the guy in Seattle over the last 3 years, and obviously the relationship with Pete Carroll, but Geno wanted an extension, and Seattle wasn't going to offer him one, as he was an older quarterback that just was one of the leaders in picks in the 2024 season, and you can attribute that to so many things. Yes, Geno struggled, but the interior offensive line in Seattle was something that was unplayable behind. It was a disastrous interior offensive line that was downright laughable. And the offensive structure in Seattle over the last few years has just been bad. Ryan Grubb struggled as an offensive play caller and was immediately fired after 1 year in Seattle. And Shane Waldron, the guy that was the first fire of 2024 with the Bears, was the offensive coordinator with the Seahawks and fired after, actually he was let go when Pete was let go. But yeah, the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks in 2023. Geno suffered a lot, and there were a lot of things Geno had to overcome in Seattle that the Raiders knew that if they gave him the right system, Geno would be their guy for him. And it's looking to be that. I think very highly of Geno, and we'll talk about all of that in just a second. Still, with that said, let's talk about the offense and everything there now. Starting with the receivers, Brock Bowers. I've already mentioned him. He was a first-round pick for the Raiders in 2024, and he's worth that selection and much more. Bowers in his first season alone immediately established himself as a top 5 tight end in the NFL, had one of the best receiving tight end seasons of all time, broke rookie records, and was just insane. He's more of a natural receiver, but can be a good blocker, and I don't really have to go into the profile for Brock Bowers. I think most of you know that if you're watching this video. But that gives Geno an elite weapon immediately day one, a weapon that's probably better than the weapons he had in Seattle. No disrespect to JSN and DK Metcalf, but DK has declined over the last few years, hasn't been the player he was, and JSN was really, really good last year. Okay, sorry. Moving on. They also have Jakobi Meyers, who had a really, really, really good showing in 2024, having over 1,000 yards in 15 games with inconsistent quarterback play throughout the entire year. And then another guy, Trey Tucker, who really formed his own role in 2024 and was really solid for most of the year. I know he had just over 500 yards, but inconsistent quarterback play is going to do that to you. And like I said, he's now forming into his own role and proved that there is something there. And then the 2 draft picks they drafted at receiver, Jack Beck and Dante Thornton Jr. Thornton Jr. has cut himself a serious role into this offense going into year 1 of his career as a 4th rounder. A guy that's probably going to take the top off and be a true around X receiver on the outside, has really good speed and physicality considering the speed, just has to sharpen his routes, doesn't need to only be a go ball type of guy, but in preseason, him and Geno proved they have a good connection, and that's already there. Jack Beck is going to be a really solid slot receiver for this team and a guy that's going to play in the role behind Jakobi Meyers and Brock Bowers, and a guy that from day one might not start, but is going to clearly be a wide receiver for this team in the future, and a guy that can get really creative with the ball in his hands. I think the biggest change for this Raiders offense going into 2025 is the running back room and the rushing offense in general. Last year, their starters were Alexander Mattison, Amir Abdullah, Zamir White, and Sincere McCormick. Going into next year, Sincere McCormick and Zamir White are going to be the 3rd and 4th string running backs. They added Ashton Jeanty, and that, well, is massive. Ashton had one of the best running back seasons of all time in 2024 for a college football player. And in 2023 was one of the best receiving backs in the country. He is insane, a top 10 pick, and deservingly so. And I'm very excited to see him in this offense. The Raiders had the worst rushing offense in the NFL last year. Simple as that. They had around 79 yards per game, bottom in the league, and that is going to change this year. They also added Miami running back Raheem Mostert, who I don't know what type of role he's going to carve himself in this offense. He might not be the player he was a few years ago. He is a 32-year-old running back and a guy that is on his last leg in the NFL. But 2 years ago, he was a goal line back that had around 20 touchdowns for a season, and that is insane. I don't know what type of role he's going to have in this offense, but limiting Zamir White and Sincere McCormick will allow them to produce better and not have to be leading backs in this offense. And I expect Ashton Jeanty to be the main guy all year long, like most people do. Moving on to the O-line. I think this is one of the more underrated units in the NFL over the last few years. And let's just start with Kolton Miller, a top 15 tackle in the NFL, maybe closer to top 10, and just got his extension at the end of July, and deservingly so. He's been really, really good for this underrated Raiders offensive line. Then DJ Glaze, I think he's a solid right tackle. I think he's fine, and that's something you can be fine with on the right side of the O-line. He'll be better than the starter that the Seahawks had last year, replacing Abraham Lucas. I can't even remember his name right now. Then you look at the interior offensive line. Dylan Parham, a really, really solid guy himself as well. A guy that has solidified himself as a starter over the last few years, a good starter over the last few years. Jordan Meredith was a very big surprise for the Raiders last year, and a guy that had them move Jackson Powers-Johnson from center to guard because they were so confident in his ability to play center, and that's been proven again in the preseason. He is named as a full-time starter center for the year. The big training camp thing for the Raiders in terms of their offensive line was Jackson Powers-Johnson and Alex Kappa. The Raiders, during the playoffs, after the Bengals cut Alex Kappa, signed Kappa almost immediately, and I think it was clear that Spytek's connection to him and Brady's connection to him from their time in Tampa Bay was a huge reason why. Kappa was one of the worst starters at guard last year, and that really, really, really was going to leave him needing a job going into 2025. And the Raiders gave that to him. It gave him a chance to try to earn that starting spot, try to regain the status he had as one of the better guards in the NFL, and that just didn't really work in preseason. I think it was a close competition that they really tried giving him a chance for, but Powers-Johnson, as of this morning, has been announced as the right guard going into the season, and I think that's the move you got to make for a guy that was drafted in the second round just last year, and a guy that was very much hyped up to be one of the better interior offensive linemen in that draft and drafts around it. I think this, like I said, I think this offensive line unit is pretty good, and I agree. It is one of the more underrated units in the NFL, and they're going to have to do their job protecting Geno this year, and I think they'll do better than what Seattle had for him last year. Again, looking at the PFF numbers, which is not all I look at, but PFF does a decent job of indicating how good an offensive line is. This offensive line looks pretty solid, and it gives them good grades across the board. I'm very excited to see what this offensive line can produce for Geno this year and what Geno will look behind a unit that is solid like the Raiders. Same for Ashton Jeanty. I know the run blocking wasn't the greatest last year, and that's proven by the numbers they had with the running backs, but the Raiders didn't have a running back anywhere near Ashton Jeanty's caliber, and I think having that is going to make him look a lot better than what last year made him look like. And this whole video is not going to be just hyping up and talking about how great I think the Raiders are. I think there are issues with the roster. The offensive line isn't perfect, but like I said, I think the offensive line is one of the better units in the NFL, or one of the more underrated units in the NFL. I think they don't have a true X wide receiver, but they have Jacoby Myers, who was very good last year, one of the few 1,000-yard receivers last year. They had Brock Bowers, who also had 1,000 yards last year, and Trey Tucker had a very solid role. And they also drafted 2 receivers in the second and fourth round. That's a solid rotation of receivers that you can feel confident about going into 2025. If they had Davante Adams, I think this is different. I think I'm talking about this offense a lot better. But they also added Geno Smith, who, again, I'm very confident in. Do I think this offense is perfect? No. But do I think this offense can be in the upper half, the upper half of the NFL? Yes. I very much think that's possible and is probably going to happen. And the parts of the roster where I'm less confident in is the defense. Starting with the defensive line, Max Crosby. I mean, he got extended. He's one of the highest paid non-quarterback players in football. He's one of the best pass rushers and run defenders in football. He's unreal. Outside of him, Malcolm Kuntz is coming back. He missed all of 2024. He had 8 sacks in 2023. Was a very, very good player for the Raiders in 2023. But I mean, I wouldn't say there's a star outside of Max Crosby, but Kuntz has been really, really solid during his time in Vegas and in the league in general. And I'm excited to see what this comeback year looks like for him. Preseason indicates that the Raiders are confident in him being opposite of Max Crosby. They traded for Thomas Booker, and they desperately needed a defensive tackle after moving on from Christian Wilkins. And if Wilkins was on this roster, I'd say, yeah, this team's a for sure playoff team. But he's not. He's not on this roster anymore. They had to cut him. And Booker and Adam are fine defensive tackle rotation, not the best. And the most interesting piece outside of their starters right now is Tyree Wilson, who, man, he has not looked like the player the Raiders drafted him to be in 2023, the Josh McDaniels regime. And yeah, he just has not looked like that player they really wanted him to be. I think in the last calendar year, if there's any report that indicates there's hope for him, it's that he's really showed promise in the interior defensive line. And right now he's listed as the backup edge rusher. I think if they move him to if they move him to 3-tech instead of nose tackle, I think he could really shine there. I think he could shine in the interior defensive line and be a solid piece for him. And yeah, again, like I said, this defensive line rotation, I anticipate they are interested in the free agent market. Jadeveon Clowney is still a free agent, and if he was going to sign anywhere, it could be here. He has a connection to Pete Carroll from his time that year in Seattle in 2019. And that would be really interesting. I would be excited to see what Jadeveon Clowney can add to this pass rush rotation, backing up Crosby or Malcolm Kuntz, who I don't hate the edge rushers. I just think the interior defensive line is not strong enough to really take advantage of what Max Crosby is going to open up for some of these guys. I think the linebackers are where this team is a little underrated. Jermaine Pratt and Landon Roberts are two really good guys that I think could contribute immediately in 2025 for this team. Landon Roberts had a really strong start for the Steelers last year and made big plays during their early success in 2024. And Jermaine Pratt was I know captain doesn't really matter much, but he was a captain for the Bengals last year and one of their better defensive players. And I know, again, their defense was not that good in 24, but he was still one of their few guys that showed to be good. He was a good player for the Bengals in 2024, and I think he'll be good for the Raiders in 2025. Outside of that, Jamal Adams could be interesting at their weak side linebacker. Jalen Smith and Devin White are two guys that are almost out of the league before signing with the Raiders, especially Jalen Smith. He has not played in almost 2 years in the NFL. He has been consistently on and off Roberts and rosters and was not even on one for all of the 2024 calendar year. Devin White was a guy that the Bucs got rid of. Then the Eagles signed and then cut almost immediately without playing him. Tommy Eichenberg and Cody Lindenberg are two guys that I think are solid, that I liked in their draft processes and could be solid backup middle linebackers. And again, probably special team players that I'm talking about right now. But anyways, the DBs are where I really, really, really struggle to be confident in. The DBs are more interesting and have showed more promise in preseason than I thought they would show. I think they are an injury away from just being straight up horrible. But Eric Stokes this is his second chance in the NFL. Like in 2021, he was really, really solid as a rookie, and there was promise. But the injuries just really limited his development over the following few seasons. And now he's here with the Raiders because the Packers freely let him go after his rookie contract ended. And I just think the injuries were too much for him and limited his development so badly. Darian Porter was a guy I really liked in the process and saw as a 2nd to 3rd round pick, and they got him in the 3rd round. They could have got Will Johnson, but they didn't. I think they traded that pick. Either way, who cares? And I think as a rookie, he'll probably have his issues, but Patrick Graham is a guy that I have always noticed gets his players ready and doesn't put them out there unprepared. And Porter has the physical tools to be a good corner at the NFL level. Kaibu Kelly is a guy that showed a lot of promise in preseason and training camp, and a guy that was one of their winners, honestly. If you look at their articles out there, he showed a lot of promise in preseason and training camp. Jeremy Chin, guy they brought over from Washington, probably will play strong safety. The original depth chart I showed, I don't think it's as accurate as it's going to be. Could be one of their defensive lineups, but I think Jeremy Chin will play more strong safety for this unit. Isaiah Palomau will be their free safety. That's where I'm a little unconfident. He was not that good last year, but we'll see. Chris Smith is a guy they've really, really, really wanted to work out and be their eventual starter, but he just hasn't developed as much as they'd like him to and has been more of a special teams guy throughout his time in Vegas. Looking at their DB core, though, like I said, they're an injury away from this being bad, but Stokes, Darian Porter, Kyle Blue Kelly is a solid rotation for now. And Darnay Holmes might play outside corner at some points in this year. They've listed him as that in sometimes. And then we'll probably play the nickel. Jeremy Chin probably will be utilized in multiple areas in this defense. Might play sub linebacker, might play nickel, might play strong safety. You never know with Jeremy Chin. He's all over the place all the time. And then their safety unit, not the most confident in. In no means do I think this Raiders defense is going to be a top half of the league unit, but I think they can be solid enough that they won't hold this team back from being a playoff team. If there was something, it would be the defense. But Patrick Graham is a stellar defensive play caller. Max Crosby is one of the best players in the NFL in general, and they have enough talent that I think Pete Carroll and Patrick Graham can get the most out of them. Offensively, this is going to be a good unit. A lot of people have underrated this Raiders team throughout the offseason, and a lot of people have talked about them like they're a clear-cut playoff squad. I think they're in the medium of that. I think they're going to be a contender for the playoffs, and I think they're going to be a team that's just going to be they're going to be hell to play against every single game because they're going to compete, and compete. Thank you for watching today. I hope all of you are excited for this NFL season as I am, and I look forward to making as much content for y'all as possible. This is Son of a Sports, and I'll catch y'all next time.